Well, the last talk of this session is by Professor Chris Hankin, who's kindly agreed to attend today as the Director of RITICS and tell us all about the scope and the wonderful research that's happening within the RITICS ecosystem.
Right. Okay, thank you. So first of all, I should say how much I've enjoyed today. I kind of came from the verification background and worked on abstract interpretation many years ago. But today, this presentation is totally different and rather superficial compared to many of the ones that you've seen today. But we felt Azalea asked me to introduce RITICS to, and towards the end of the talk, I'll try to reflect a little bit on how verification might have a role to play in the RITICS agenda. And I see, looking at this slide, actually, that I got the title either in the program or on this slide wrong because they're inconsistent. But I'll start off talking about cybersecurity of critical infrastructure systems and then tell you what RITICS is all about and some of the things we've done. And then I'll tell you a little bit about a couple of things that we're working on Imperial at the moment, and end up with a few reflections on how verification might be applied to the work that RITICS is doing. Like that, RITICS involves many universities, and I'll touch upon some of those as I go through this. Some of the slides I'm presenting today were prepared in collaboration with a postdoc of mine, Martin Berrer, who actually is starting as a lecturer with Bridgesh in Surrey in about 2 weeks' time. So that will provide a direct personal link potentially between what we're doing in RITICS and some of the stuff that's going on in VeTSS going forward. So the title I gave was about critical infrastructure systems. I'm sure you're all aware that in the UK setting, that means really the use of, because I'm talking about cybersecurity, the use of digital systems in these 13 sectors. It's the current definition of what critical national infrastructure is for the UK. And if you just look at those, some of them, maybe like finance, really involve fairly traditional IT systems, and a lot of what many of you have been working on and talking about today apply to those traditional IT systems. But an awful lot of them, and those are the ones really that RITICS has concentrated on, aren't really traditional IT systems. They're effectively cyber-physical systems. There are many critical systems in that set of 13. The systems which are implemented are cyber-physical. And I suppose the area which RITICS concentrates on most is what we call operational technology, which is the components which interface most directly with the physical world in systems. There's a number of differences which are sort of highlighted on this slide just to sort of set a context so that you have the right frame of mind as you listen to the rest of what I say. The first thing maybe really is points 2 and 4, which can be taken together, which is that the replacement cycle for operational technology is rather different to what we see in the IT sphere. So we have, I think someone earlier today used the word legacy. We have legacy in spades in critical infrastructure systems and in operational technology. One aspect of operational technology that you might care to think about is the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier, which was launched maybe a year ago. That, from my perspective and from the RITICS perspective, is a collection of floating industrial control systems that will be expected to operate for maybe 30, 40 years with limited opportunity for refit. So still today, if we look around carefully enough, we'll find industrial control systems which are still running DOS and operating systems like that as their main operating system. Coupled with that, if you think about those sectors, included there was things like civil nuclear, and we would expect these systems to be running 24/7. Slotting in maintenance cycles is very difficult. And whereas the preferred fix for many of the vendors is that they make an announcement of a vulnerability and then issue a patch and expect you to patch within a few hours of them announcing it. Otherwise, you're vulnerable to all sorts of malicious people. In this setting, you're unlikely to patch, or indeed in many sectors, you're unlikely to patch at all. Because these, someone else mentioned earlier on this issue of safety, and safety is a paramount property of these systems, and they're often regulated by things like the Health and Safety Executive, and preparing a safety risk assessment for these systems takes months. And if you start changing the software, you're actually validating the safety case you have. So, so in many cases, it's unlikely that these systems will be patched. They tend to be geographically dispersed, maybe not on a battleship, but certainly if you think about oil refineries and so on, the kit is all over the place. And what we're seeing, of course, with digitalization is that they're increasingly exposed to the internet. So we've got a cybersecurity problem, but they're rather different sorts of systems from the ones that we typically think about when we think about IT. So RITICS is the Research Institute in Trustworthy Interconnected Cyber-Physical Systems. It started off life as the Research Institute in Trustworthy Industrial Control Systems. The acronym's the same. But we've broadened our scope somewhat. It was founded in 2014. It's been through one refresh in 2018, and we've just signed a contract that Imperial will be directing it for another 5 years going forward. The scope of RITICS is somehow visually represented by the circle on the right-hand side. We've got sort of 6 main areas that we've concentrated on really since 2018, and we're continuing to concentrate on going forward. The first point, starting in the sort of 12 o'clock till 2 o'clock sort of area, is about really understanding this cyber-physical aspect of these systems. What sort of harm arises, physical harm arises from cyber interference. And of course, some of the sector is more concerned with people with hammers getting to railway tracksides and so on and doing cyber interference. But really the general problem is, what does cyber do in terms of physical operation of these systems? There's issue around risk. I guess in IT systems and in most of your worlds, people tend not to talk about air gaps, but certainly in this area, many people will take the view that their operational technology is air gapped from the rest of the world, and therefore it doesn't really need much cyber security protection. The air gap, of course, is completely mythical, and basically with increasing digitization, it becomes more and more mythical. But even if we go back to 2010, the Iranian uranium enrichment plant in Natanz was subject to the Stuxnet attack, which many of you know about, and but the operators would have felt that their system was completely air-gapped. So there's a risk issue, and there's a need to communicate that risk so that people understand the need to invest. There's something about protection, so what sort of cybersecurity controls and so on can be put in place. There's a recognition that things will go wrong, so what can we do about responding when things do go wrong? This is a kind of regulated space now because of the Network and Information Security Directive that was introduced in Europe in 2018 and has been implemented in the UK with heavy financial fines if operators of essential services lose those services if there are disruptions, and they can be shown to be negligent with respect to the kind of cyber protections they have in place. There's issues around economics, and then there's issues around cultural barriers, because these systems are not run by computer scientists, and they're run by control engineers who believe in the air gap, who need to be educated, and who talk a totally different language to us. So there's a kind of cultural issue that needs to be overcome. So RITICS has been around for a long time. We've done quite a lot of things. The first thing, I guess, is that we created a research community, which didn't exist in the UK prior to the creation of RITICS, looking at this issue of cybersecurity for operational technology. I'm pleased to see Mark here, who was one of the founding members of that community. I don't think there is anyone else here, but forgive me if I if I'm too short-sighted to have seen you. So we've done, we started off like RIA, PAV did as a collection of projects. We've increasingly become a more coordinated community. There's a lot that came out of those projects. We've contributed to various industrial cybersecurity strategies that have been developed in the UK for the railways and for air traffic control and so on and so forth. We've built lots of tools for building models of complex cyber physical systems. We actually have physical test beds in Lancaster and Bristol. There's very substantial testbed facilities replicating water treatment systems and bits of the grid and sort of power grid and so on. We've developed a board game that executives can play so that they better understand the risks that they might face. We built hardware. We built secure synchrophaser technology for interfacing renewable energy systems into the grid. And we contributed to European certification activities as well. And the program from 2018 to 2022, we've sort of lost the heading on this slide. I thought there was a heading on it, but basically there's been a lot of concentration on the Network and Information Security Directive that I mentioned. I mentioned safety a few moments ago. There is this quite interesting sort of interaction between safety requirements and security requirements in these systems, and getting a kind of trade-off right, and the understanding of those relationships is something that is still a research topic. I'm interested in autonomous systems, as Kirsten was this morning. Forensics is rather different in this setting. Maybe if something goes wrong with your IT system, you take it offline and you can spend a day or two sort of investigating what happened to it. Because of the 24/7 operation, you can't take down an air traffic control system and isolate it for 2 or 3 days while you do a forensic investigation. So you have to take a slightly different perspective on what forensics means in this. I won't go through any more of these. These are the sort of typical phrases that you see bandied around. Supply chain security issues are a big thing. And I do just want to say something about the interconnection though, because another aspect of the digitalization is that suddenly a lot of these critical systems now effectively are interconnected, so that if things do go wrong, you run the risk of cascading failures. A favorite kind of example I have, which has nothing to do with cyber actually, is from August 2019, when a lightning strike hit a substation somewhere in Middle England and took down the substation for a few tens of seconds. But because of the load balancing software in the grid, the effect of that was that another substation went down, and there was loss of power to part of the country for a maximum of about 30 minutes. But as a consequence of that, the rail network across a large part of the UK was actually stopped, essentially because of loss of power to the rail lines. An airport in Newcastle, I think, was affected. A hospital in Ipswich was affected. These all happened because of a relatively short disruption in the power system. So a disruption in the power system had effect on transport systems and healthcare provision systems. The railway actually took 24 hours at least to get back into proper functionality, because many of the trains that had stopped had to be manually restarted. So engineers had to travel around the country, not using the railway because the rail wasn't working, to actually restart the train. So the interconnectivity and understanding that interconnectivity is very important. And I'll come back to that in a few moments, because some of the work that we're doing at Imperial is about looking at some of that interconnectivity. And I just want to say that we were talking about small grants earlier. NCSC have been very generous to RITICS in that the new contract that we have has some money for fellowships. And we've just gone through a process of having a call for our first 2 fellowships on RITICS, and we will be having further calls. So please look out, particularly since we're trying to build links with VETS and with the other research institutes. The topics for the fellowships in this first call were around fragility and resilience, digital twins and modeling and economics. And hopefully within the next day or two, we'll be announcing the successful recipients of those first two fellowships. Just to mention the universities that have been involved in RITICS, there's a whole host of about 25 actually. There's only 19, well, there's only 9 explicitly named on this slide. There's another 10 who are quite actively involved, but there's about 25 to 30 universities which regularly receive our newsletters and get around to producing them again. Our website is hosted by a third-party supplier, and they were subject to a ransomware attack at the beginning of the year. Freud effectively was the RITICS website, but I'm very pleased to say that as of 2 o'clock this afternoon, it's back up again. So you can see what we do.
Chris, when did it happen?
It happened at the end of January, so it's been down for pretty much 2 months, which is very frustrating.
It's interesting because we're trying to revamp the VETS website and our model was, oh, RITICS website is so shiny.
Well, it's shiny again now since 2 o'clock. So as I say, I was just going to say a few things about what we do at Imperial, and maybe I don't have a lot of time to do this, but one of the things we've been doing, for example, is to look at trying to identify the most critical components in a cyber physical system. So you can't see this at all, and that's intentional, of course, but the top image is actually part of Cyprus, where I do all of my teaching these days. So it's nice to go to Cyprus and teach, certainly when it's rather cold and wet here. But that's actually a water distribution system around the city of Larnaca. And it's quite a complex, obviously, cyber physical system. And what we've been interested in doing is looking at this to try to identify effectively critical components that an attacker might be attracted to in order to compromise the overall distribution of water in that area. So I'm not going to stick with that network because that was rather complex, but what we've been doing is looking at dependencies between subcomponents in a system, representing dependencies effectively by and/or graphs. So capturing both disjunctive and conjunctive dependencies between components. The numbers you see on that image on the right-hand side is an estimation of the amount of effort an attacker would have to put in to compromise that particular component. And the task is to try to identify where the most likely points are that an attacker would want to interfere with these systems. The and/or graphs, we actually sort of look at those then ultimately as logical formulae and use weighted partial max-sat solution techniques to try to identify the critical components.
So you said the numbers are the amount of effort?
Yeah, so you could take that
unit?
from something like CVSS, or there's an industrial vulnerability scoring system now, which parallels CVSS, and it gives you an idea of how difficult it might be for an attacker to actually use that vulnerability to compromise the system. So the units are sort of irrelevant, a slightly academic sort of problem at the moment, but
so having inf is good. Doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. So so what we do is we effectively take those graphs, we convert them into a logical formulae, of course, and then what we're interested in is the T in this formula is actually the target node, the node that provides the actual service, as it were. And what we're then looking at is the negation of that logical formulae and looking at some satisfaction of that negation, which will give us an idea of how the attacker might disrupt the system. And then because the nodes are weighted, we use a weighted max-sat to actually come up with that solution. So that just says the same thing. We actually work with hypergraphs because we're interested in multiple security controls around an object. So you might consider, particularly in the cyber physical setting, you might consider, for example, putting substations behind fences and maybe components of substations inside locked cabinets behind those fences. So you would represent that sort of a setup by this kind of hypergraph representation. And this is all implemented in a tool called Metaphorics. we've shown that it scales readily to the sort of networks that I showed on the first slide on this topic. We've actually shown up to 20,000 nodes in the network. It's still very reasonably handleable by this tool that we have. There's a publication, and I think the slides might be available later, so you can look at the publications if you want to. And we've also, so that was using these kind of integer values. We've also looked at using probabilities on these nodes, which you might want to do if you're looking at safety critical systems, trying to identify the mission critical components. And we've actually looked at fly-by-wire situation, looking primarily at the pitch. Plane stays on a steady course, dependent on three things: roll, pitch, and yaw. We've looked at the pitch controls and looked at probability of failure of individual components in an Airbus type aircraft to try and identify what the critical components in such things might be. And there's a paper on that in the Transactions on Cyber-Physical Systems from 2021. Okay, and then finally, so that I finish on time, I think I've just got a couple of slides maybe looking at the stuff we're doing most recently, which is looking at cyber-physical attack graphs. Many of you will be familiar with attack graphs and their use in understanding what the possibilities for compromise of an IT system might be. The only thing with cyber-physical attack graphs is that we throw in the possibility of physical compromise of different parts of a system alongside the cyber compromise. And we've just submitted a paper on, and we've coupled the cyber-physical attack graphs with some Bayesian analysis to do risk analysis and look at potential strategies for hardening systems and so on. And we've just submitted a paper on this, which hopefully I'll be able to provide on demand in a few weeks' time, I hope. Okay, so really that was a very rapid whir through. Then I was asked to think about verification and RITICS. So the sort of things that I thought about immediately are on this slide. So the first thing is that I haven't said what a PLC is, but if you've come across this sort of setting before, you'll realize that the physical interface of cyber-physical systems is often a controller with some sensors and actuators doing certain things. The controllers are called, or one very popular class of controller is called a programmable logic controller. It's programmed with a very rudimentary kind of assembler language, which is called ladder logic. It's an area which is a prime area for interference by cyber. It's often many of the cyber attacks on cyber-physical systems that you hear about are because someone has actually managed to gain access to a PLC and change the ladder logic so that it doesn't do what you originally hoped it might do. And as far as I know, there's very little work done on verification of these ladder logic programs. There's lots of communication protocols involved in these industrial control systems and critical infrastructure systems. They're not all TCP/IP. There's lots of proprietary protocols. And again, very little work seems to have been done on verification of these protocols. So it seems to me that there's work done there. Digital twins and modeling is a topic for the latest RITICS fellowships, but it's also clearly a big topic for the UK and for the world in general. So the construction of digital twins and understanding how they really relate to the systems that they're meant to be modeling, I think is an area that is just beginning and is therefore ripe for consideration in the verification community. Talked about safety and security already. I think also there are issues there. And then finally, the final point is really that we're seeing increasing use of AI, in particular machine learning techniques in this setting. I've said ML for intrusion detection systems there. That's where a lot of the papers that we've seen using machine learning in this context have actually focused. So this is about using deep learning and so on to try to identify anomalies in network traffic flowing into these systems. And this brings us back to the question which came up this morning about sort of understandable, if you like, machine learning. How do we know that machine learning is detecting the right sorts of things in these systems? So I think that was probably 25 minutes, but I think I'll stop there. I'll take any questions, but maybe we want a cup of coffee or tea.
Thank you so much. Chris, Sophia, then Matt.
So you have shown us this graph where there were nodes and the intruder gets into the building and then 0.3, I suppose that's a probability, then they get into the room and so on. These arrows and the probabilities you are attaching, are they given to you or is there a way to calculate them?
So the arrows, yeah, okay. So the arrows represent dependencies between the probabilities. They're so they are sort of given to us. I mean, in for example, the civil context, we sat down with engineers responsible for the plant and looked at the kind of protections they have in place and then looked either at the specs. I mean, so if you have a lock cabinet, the lock will have some rating from the manufacturers. So that gives you an idea of how vulnerable that might be to various types of interference. So for the physical components, we get that kind of information. For the cyber components, we can use some kind of vulnerability scoring system to get an estimation of what the likelihood is that the thing can be exploited.
So on your early slides, you said about patching being very do or not really ever done, but also then you had for becoming more networked, so more things are actually sort of accessible. Do you think that might affect the likelihood of people patching because it's easier to patch if there's some kind of routine or?
Yeah, I think maybe I overstated the case, but I think so. I think probably at the moment, when patching is done occasionally, people will have a separate test bed and then fully test the patch on that test bed before deploying it on the system. Because not everyone can have that separate test bed. So people who don't, people who probably aren't going to do the patching. And I don't think the fact that things are getting more digitalized is actually going to really encourage them to do more because of this this trade-off. The safety thing. So if they're running a system that's regulated by the Health and Safety Executive, for example, in this country, they're still not going to want to change their system and have to go through the certification, safety certification. So
even if they know it's wrong, it's
so they'll live with it and try to put other things in place. So you could use, for example, some kind of whitelisting set up to try to prevent stuff on your system that is expected.
To add to Sophia's question, actually, so you went from a and/or graph to a and/or hypergraph. That's what you meant. What do you mean by hypergraph? Is it in the most dimensional or so what is the definition of?
So you've got hyper edges which actually connect lots of nodes rather than just a point-to-point connection.
Okay.
Not the other question.
With respect to your point about certification, do you think the current processes of software certification are getting the balance right in the sense that they're currently dissuading patches, or do you think they should be changed to be more permissive of patches for security reasons?
That's a good question. I guess it's probably horses for courses. I mean, do you want weaker regulation on civil nuclear so that people can patch their systems, or would you prefer them to find some other way of protecting their systems? Whereas maybe in some other infrastructure sectors, you might be more prepared to let them slightly weaken certification process.
I mean, I guess it's a pragmatic question of is it really weaker if it's causing buggy software to persist for longer? And that's maybe a pragmatic question that you have to judge. There's no clear way to do it.